John, what's up?
Hey guys.
John,
How
how
you
we
doing?
doing?
Well, a little overwhelmed as you might imagine because we're doing a token launch starting next week. So that's pretty crazy, but having a lot of fun with it. Just not a lot of sleep.
Let's go. I listened to your spaces with the ICM.run crew and Media Collective crew.
Nice.
You're a great speaker.
Thank you. That's nice of you to say.
Yeah, dude, we're excited to
Let's
get
see what we
into
can
it.
do today.
Hash it out. We kind of always start with just background, John. So if you want to let us know your background, how you got into this, how you became this big compute guy and created this big Beamables network, we'd love to hear that.
My background is kind of divided into two big areas. So one is I've been in web development tools. So I started a company called ePrize and took it public on NASDAQ, grew it to a company of about 300 people. So just solving ways for people to get their websites up faster is what it comes down to. And then did something completely different, which is I started a game studio and we built games based on things that you all have heard about. So Game of Thrones and Star Trek, Walking Dead, Archer. So we built those games, shipped games to 20 million people.
Wow.
Built one of the first blockchain games there. We didn't call them Web3 games quite yet, but we built a blockchain edition of the Star Trek game in one of the early gaming chains, minted 1 million wallets there. So had both of those sides. Personally speaking, I was mining Bitcoin in a JavaScript program that I embedded into my blog like back in 2011. So I was pretty early to crypto, but really didn't start building around it until that blockchain game I just described. But that's my background. I guess we can save the rest about where we go next.
Very cool. Yeah, and that's a pretty awesome background. You have tons of experience shipping some of those games.
Don,
It sounds
can I have
surreal.
yeah, I want to, sorry, Don, to cut you off. I wanted to ask actually your take on how Web3 gaming has evolved. Because actually, I was on Spaces with you back in the day, discussed this with Jonah Blake,
Yeah.
and Jonah and I are business partners. But yeah, just want to hear kind of your take of how you've seen it evolve. And Don, sorry for cutting you off there, buddy.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, it's a category that's really struggled, frankly. I think that's no surprise to anybody. I think a lot of teams got started on this without really knowing what they were getting into. The games that I think are going to have the most likelihood for success are mostly game teams that have worked together on pretty big game projects before. I think the thing to understand with Web3 is it's fundamentally a business model. It's not really a kind of game, right? So that's kind of the challenge there is no one's truly cracked the code on the business model yet. And onboarding into that business model because it's built around a crypto economy is not like a total slam dunk either. So we have great Web3 developers on our platform. So Mythical Games with FIFA Rivals and Pudgy Party and Project O, Wildcard Alliance. Like these are some really, really capable teams that frankly have been in the game industry for a while. So I think we're going to see some successes because these teams are super competent. But I think it is going to take a while for Web3 to emerge as like a big category. Because when we talk about gaming is about a $200 billion a year consumer market. Currently, Web3 games are pretty tiny, less than 1%. I mean, frankly, even like a tenth of 1% kind of piece of that market. That's not to say some of them aren't going to blow up and become the next Call of Duty or something, but it'll just kind of take time to uncover those. Which, by the way, is exactly why when we built Beamable, though, we knew that while supporting Web3 game developers was going to be important for us, especially given that we're pretty crypto native and understand the tech behind it. It's been a great niche for us. But really, this market and what we're thinking of as compute capital markets on Solana with this focus around gaming, at least for initial foothold, it's got to be able to go after all game developers. And I think that's kind of been the misfire a little bit for a lot of game infra tech that has tried to tokenize around like Web3 only, in that it's just too small of a market today to sustain a game tech company. But we started as a game tech company 5 years ago to help any game developer on chain, off chain, free to play, premium, subscription. Like mostly those games share 95% of the same technical requirements, which is they have to have a lot of back-end compute. And that's the problem that we've been solving for. So a game, as it scales up, needs game servers, orchestration, social systems, payment systems. All of these things are kind of the same across different genres. And so we took a horizontal approach. And that's kind of how we have been building the company so far, and we've got roughly 100 games that have launched on the platform. So it's also real and operational, and 2.5 million people played the games on the network last month, both Web 2 and Web 3. So that said, like, where we're going is, like, in gaming, for those of you who've been following gaming, there's been almost this hackneyed phrase of, we got to onboard game developers to Web 3. But what you're saying is that you want them to change their business model, which is a tough sell to most game studios, frankly. Our pitch is, well, we are onboarding all of you game developers to Web3 by making your infrastructure priced much better, doesn't go down like it did in the Amazon crash last week, and it's built around an open ecosystem that anybody could use. You build your game however you want, free to play, blockchain. Like, we wish you success, whatever your business model is, but change the infrastructure and be more sustainable, because game developers spend like 20% of their income back out on this infra.
So help me understand this. You're basically building compute capital markets, if you will. You're building decentralized compute, and then your main target audience right now just happens to be gamers. You started in gaming, and now that's your audience for this decentralized compute that you're offering.
Yeah, that's right. So the premise of our compute network is that if you can subdivide compute down into tiny, tiny units, you can then distribute it over a computer network, right? So Beamable's tech, we call them microservices. Each invocation of a microservice is what we call an API call. So it's not really about leasing and provisioning individual computers. It's about gaining access to compute capacity. You can almost kind of draw a parallel to energy markets, where, like, you can have a solar energy panel, you can sell energy back to the grid. Well, in this, you have computers that are connected to the internet. They generate compute, which all these games are basically just, they need that to grow, and you can gain access to it in a decentralized way. And what blockchain brings to the table is these subdivisible units of compute are wrapped within an asset structure via blockchain that allows us to price them, have market forces that shape pricing. And if servers go down that supply that compute, it's really just a rerouting problem on the network, as opposed to your whole game is shut down. So that's kind of the premise behind compute capital markets as we've thought about it. Now, why gaming? Gaming has some of the spikiest demands out there. Like, a game, when it launches, it can need 1 million players to play that game, and then it has to be able to deprovision rapidly. So that's actually where an aggregate network built around these subdivisible unit of compute is really, really valuable, because you don't have to think in terms of, I need this many computers. I just need this much compute thrown at my game as it scales up and down. So that's one aspect of it. And it's just a great use case for proving out the network. And the third is, I'm a big believer in, you look for dense networks of customers that talk to each other, and then when you win them over, they're all telling each other about how great it is. It's really hard to do that on a horizontal basis. I think that's why some deep in compute networks struggle somewhat, because they're just so horizontal that they got to find any customers that can exist, instead of building a foothold with a category of customer that trusts you, and then you grow out from there. Aspirationally, we want to grow into lots of other markets with our compute network, but gaming is a great market. We want to be known as, like, very high uptime, economic, reliable, open source, open ecosystem. And then we will grow out from there. But frankly, it's probably years down the road, because the gaming market, when we get outside of Web3 and you look at the entire gaming industry, they're spending billions and billions and billions of dollars on compute and infrastructure. It's a great market for us to go after. We don't have to go outside of that. And we can be much more efficient being kind of dominant in that category versus just try to be all things to all people.
There's a reason why when Jeff Bezos left Amazon, he put the head of AWS as the new CEO, and AWS was a massive revenue driver for Amazon and arguably made it into the $1 trillion company that it is. So help me just understand from a computer standpoint how this works, because people, I guess, choose AWS because, they're a single provider. They have massive centralized data centers that, you just know that if I pay my subscription, it kind of works. Of course, except for last week when it didn't.
Yesterday when it did again.
Yeah, maybe yesterday when it did again. But I think when people think of these decentralized depend compute networks, just they're not as reliable. Like you have like indie people who are like, oh, I got some graphics cards over here, I put it on the network. Like, can that really replace an Amazon Web Services for a game with like 1,000 concurrent users or something like that, or even 1,000,000 concurrent users?
Yes, because when you add enough compute capacity the way we're doing it, it doesn't really matter. Like, well, it matters so if all the servers started going down, it starts to be a problem. But in general, we're looking for people who add compute capacity that can offer 99% or better uptime back to the network. And then when you aggregate that across many providers, your effective uptime is actually then much better than 99%. It's 99.99% because you've got so many routes that you can go through to obtain the compute that you need to throw at these applications.
Right. So this isn't like Josh with his old ETH mining rigs and GPUs providing compute. These are kind of professional people that understand infrastructure that are like, okay, I can give you this amount of, I don't know, what do you call it, megawatts, or what's the unit of measurement?
I love the comparison to the energy market. This is sort of like how we think of it. It's not watts though. It's what we call API calls.
Okay.
And people price and API calls are sort of an average of compute that happens over the network. We did 10 billion API calls last month. So there's a lot of, and so you're kind of asking architecturally how it works as well. So there's worker nodes, there's checker nodes. Worker nodes are the compute providers. So they're the ones that actually respond to and serve up API calls. And they enter into an order book what they want to price their API calls at. Games decide what they're willing to pay. There's a matching process where we find a market equilibrium price. And then the game is happy because they're getting all the compute that they need. The worker node is paid in Beamable network token, which is the principal use of that really is as the medium of exchange and the node incentive mechanism across the network. And then we have checker nodes. And checker nodes have the job of essentially validating transactions, making sure that everyone's playing fair. They can approve payments to worker nodes. They can slash a worker node if it looks like someone's cheating. So those are the two types. The big difference between them is, you're right, worker nodes are not your retired ETH rig in the basement that was sitting around. That's going to be data center capacity. So that's, there's hundreds and hundreds of data centers in the world that are secure, high performing, and that's kind of the target market for worker nodes. Longer term roadmap, we do have a lot of ideas around how you allow, say, lower quality compute to join the network as well, for lack of a better term, because there's actually a market for lower quality compute. Some people would be willing to pay a lower fee to get access to less reliable compute. That's a little bit down the road for us, at least initially. Worker nodes are concentrated at the best data centers in the world. Amazon, by the way, welcome to be on it. They will be one of it, but also like what we call bare metal service providers in this market. So these are companies that have created data centers that sell that capacity typically directly to customers, B2B customers, but then they have a lot of underutilized capacity that they can add to the network. The difference with checker nodes is that's commodity hardware. You could throw that, any Raspberry Pi that can download a Docker image, you could run it off that. So that old ETH mining rig, probably perfectly fine to do that with, or you could even just run it in the cloud. We've teamed up with some node as a service providers like NodeOps and Impstones to be able to run it for you if you want to do that.
Yeah, and so you've convinced then both data center providers and game developers that this is a good idea and that Beamable can overtake Amazon. That's been a successful kind of like, how's that conversation gone usually?
Well, game developers, this is one of our unfair advantages, frankly. And you ask like, why games, why kind of focus on a specific vertical out of the gate? And that's because we've got a 5-year history now working with game studios, everything from small indie startups to some of the biggest game publishers in the world are already launched or building on Beamable. So we have those relationships. We've established that trust. So, and we're also continuing to add more customers. Like a game is shipping on our platform like once every week or two. So we've got that pipeline. We've got people using it. The way most game developers work, though, is they don't want to know anything about blockchain. They don't want to know anything about wallets. They really don't want to know anything about a cryptocurrency. So that's where we've also made a big investment in making it easy for them, right? So if we think of the way the network is structured, there's a demand side and a supply side. So the demand side is those game developers, and you have to make it accessible to anybody. So our solution for them is they download an SDK from us, and game developers mostly use one of three technologies. For anybody who follows game development, it's an engine called Unity, an engine called Unreal Engine, or they are just building like a web browser-based game. Those are the three main ways that like 90% plus of all games are made right now. You download that SDK, and all of the server provisioning stuff to actually gain access to capacity, scale up, all of that, that's just done inside the engine. Like there's a studio editing environment where they actually work on games. And that whole provisioning piece, you don't have to know anything about blockchain. In fact, most people won't even know it's blockchain, frankly. Like they only care that they went to beamable.com, which is the customer-facing site where we say very little about blockchain other than blockchain support for people that are building blockchain games. But in general, it's just generalized platform for game development. They download that. That's all that they need to know. And as long as it works, then they're happy. And we have a history of it working with 99.9% SLAs. Cool thing with blockchain is now we start putting SLAs and performance and reputation online, on chain as well. So actually having an immutable record of how things have gone over time and how worker nodes have performed. So people will be able to fact check us in the future in a way that you can't do with the hyperscalers. Now on the supply side, that's crypto native. That's people that get the token, they operate nodes, they want to earn the nodes, the node emissions rewards, which are the token. So that's the crypto native side, which kind of has its own separate side of things, which is beamable.network instead of beamable.com.
So, John, you mentioned a few things, a few reasons why you're using blockchain. But I guess my broader question would be, you guys choose to use blockchain. You keep it as underlying technology. You don't really let people know. They don't have to know. It's not their business. Like it's just kind of underlying technology. Why are you guys choosing to use blockchain rails and people like AWS and some other providers don't? What's the benefit there?
Yeah, well, first of all, they can know. It's not a secret, and sure, they're welcome to just access the protocol at a protocol level as well. But as we know, like you start telling developers, hey, here's the protocol spec, like build on it. Like that's a very small percentage of developers who will put up with that. So they need the easy SDK, the easy payment gateways, things like that we provide on that side of things. Refresh me on the other part of the question, though.
Yeah, I guess the question is just in general, why even use blockchain?
Yeah.
Rather like AWS or competitors maybe don't. Why do you guys choose blockchain?
Well, it's a completely different approach to the market. It's, with AWS and Azure and GCP, which are the big three hyperscalers, they own zillions of servers and they essentially lease them to you at contractual rates, and they manage that whole process for you. They're not an open ecosystem. They're not a market economy. So my vision for the future around the way compute is accessed is, instead of being a contract with someone, meaning a traditional contract and a smart contract, it is a market for compute, and you access it as a protocol. So in this future, I think Amazon and GCP and Azure will all be there. Just like in the energy markets, there are lots of people who generate capacity and they add that energy to the grid. So ultimately, I think that the hyperscalers will be part of this market economy in the future, but there are going to be many more participants because the market's going to be far more democratized. There's a lot of data centers that offer bare metal server capacity to people today who do not have massive sales and marketing channels like the big three do. and are kind of inconsistent from one to the next. So it's not like if you build in one, it's a slam dunk to switch off and go elsewhere. So for a lot of these other providers, it gives them the ability to take their compute infrastructure, connect into a market-driven network, provide compute, and just earn extra money really from their CapEx investments from the compute that they already were going to have anyway. So I think the market will evolve. The way that you do it and the reason why blockchain is so valuable for this is that to go from subdivisible units of compute, which by the way, that capability exists already. So there's things called microservices, or in the case of Azure, they have a tech called Azure Functions. There's something called Lambdas at Amazon. These are basically just ways of breaking down compute into small pieces that can then scale up and scale down according to the demand for those pieces. So we're taking a similar technology from that. In our case, it's called microservices. We distribute that over our network, but the difference is instead of contracting with it and using like their siloed approaches to this, what we do is we use blockchain to enable that to become a peer-to-peer transaction via the protocol. So when a game provisions access to those resources, it goes directly to that supplier. The compute comes and like the payment of the game to that supply provider, we aren't in the middle of that. The protocol facilitates it, but essentially that supply provider gets all of that payment. And then there's a small network fee that we add on top of that just to fund the network, the protocol, the foundation kind of operations itself. So to do that on a peer-to-peer basis requires a way to know that everyone's playing fair. You need programmatic value exchange. It's one of the really magical things that happen with the advent of not only blockchain, but smart contracts. Smart contracts enabled you to have programs and APIs or really protocols where different pieces of software communicate with each other and value can be exchanged, which was not something that was thought of like in the original internet. We've got email and HTML, and there's no payment built into that. It's just protocols for exchanging information. So I don't know if anyone knew that we were going to have, tens of millions of people on certain websites at that point in time.
Crazy.
But if you embed the value exchange into the protocol, you can basically say, let's have a marketplace where any supply provider not only offers the compute, but the payment of that compute is embedded in the protocol as well. And that's where blockchain is really powerful. But to do it, you need blockchain because it's also a consensus network to enable peer-to-peer. So a somewhat long, but not long enough explanation of like why blockchain is the enabler. And just comes down to there is no better technology for having a peer-to-peer network of supply providers and those who need to consume that supply and having a market-driven economy for access to that resource.
This is fascinating. I love this comparison you make to energy because it almost feels like energy going into the grid was like a proof of concept for decentralized compute. So I love how you're doing. If we had to visualize this for a second, and I'm not sure if you guys have posted any visualizations of this, but if I had to think about it, it's kind of like an order book where you have, hopefully millions of people coming in and placing different ask prices for their compute. And then you have supply side come in, people that need this compute and actually bidding up this to find a fair market value. I don't know, maybe just give me a visualization of how that looks for the people that are maybe a little less technical.
Yeah, I think you've got it right. So worker nodes are on the network and they really just supply compute. And the analogy you just gave to energy, I think is a pretty good one. And just in terms of thinking about it, there are differences between energy and compute for sure. But it's like having solar panels and selling your kilowatt hours back to the grid. And the order book determines what you price it at. So what are the differences to energy? Well, one is that you're not using an order book. It's not truly a market economy. You're going to get whatever the local power company is willing to pay you, or more often than not is forced to pay you because they don't really want to pay you. They just have been told they have to through regulation. Another big difference is like energy has transmission loss. It's not really something that can be fully decentralized in the same way as compute can, in that you can have a game server on one side of the planet and a game on the opposite side of the planet, and depending on latency conditions that you're willing to tolerate, that may be totally fine for the majority of games. In other cases, you might need lower latency, more localized servers that are faster to respond to requests. So that's kind of a difference with compute. But the big thing with compute is just far, far more decentralizable, in that the compute providers are essentially generating compute, offering it back to the compute grid instead of an energy grid that can be then drawn from by a variety of applications. In our case, games, is we're focusing in on that.
Can you have like when I look at the supply and demand metrics of this, you obviously need a balance of both. Can you have an oversupply of compute?
You can. That's the problem with DPIN generally, right? So like most DPIN projects don't have demand when they boot up. So they've offered all these node incentives and lots of tokens on the supply side. And they just assume that because you put a bunch of supply out there that the demand arrives. But the world doesn't look like that. I mean, now you're on one of my critiques of my own industry here in blockchain, which is like there's too many projects that are solutions in search of a problem. There's too many things that focus on supply because it's like the token generating side. And then they just dilute their whole token distribution before they have any kind of intelligent ratio of supply and demand. So, I mean, the only real answer to that is, as we grow the network, we have to do it mindfully. We haven't gone out and spun up a bazillion nodes that are going to mine the token just for the sake of mining the token without delivering the actual needs of these games. And that's an advantage we have, starting with 2.5 million players on the network last month and 10 billion API calls. And it's growing pretty consistently because we've got more and more games adding to the compute network every month. So ultimately, though, it is like a supply and demand thing, in that if there's an oversupply and you have a market economy, it's at least self-correcting, because some people will decide to withdraw from the market because it's not profitable for them to do it anymore. And that's also okay. We just want to be a little bit mindful of like not booting up a whole bunch of supply that can't actually get utilized. But the nice thing about this, though, is you're still pricing according to those fungible units. It's not like you have a bunch of servers and people are provisioning them, or they're just sitting there waiting to be provisioned. You can always reallocate them to something else, and we dynamically utilize the compute capacity of these servers. It's another thing in DPIN. Like, and this isn't a general criticism of DPIN or anything, but there are different approaches to the problem. I think there are DPIN where the piece of equipment that represents the physical piece of the decentralized physical infrastructure network is essentially only used by one customer at a time. Ones that can be more fungible than that, who can essentially spread their supply across any number of customers who can utilize that, I think they're actually in a much more capital efficient build out, because now you've got a much higher ratio between supply providers and demand providers. You don't have to like lock up a machine for exclusive use for a period of time. Although there's uses for that too, like there are uses for that, but at least in our design, we think we get to the most capital efficiency by thinking of it as a fungible energy-like resource.
Like Helium found this out the hard way. So Helium had this like decentralized, before DPIN was even a thing, Helium put out these like LoRa LAN units. I deployed like 100 of them. And it was like no one used it, right? It was like, okay, we diluted our token. The H&T token just kind of went to whatever. Luckily, they came up with 5G and like build all these cellular, partnerships and kind of their network. But I'll talk about the demand side a little bit. I used to run a little gaming studio, and we used to rack up, 4 or 5K a month in AWS services, which were, kind of significant for us as a startup at the time. AWS makes tens of billions of dollars. Riot Games wrote that they saved $10 million going from whatever service they had before to AWS. So maybe my question is more on the demand side. Like, you have 2.5 million players, 11 billion API calls today. Do you have demand already? Like, you mentioned some names, but like, what do those contracts look like? How much money are those studios putting or paying you as maybe a business today? And I guess what kind of demand do you think that'll drive for a token?
Yeah, so a few things to unpack there. So first of all, with Helium specifically, I have my own live stream. I had Amir, the CEO of Helium, on it just several weeks back, and asked him,
amazing.
What's hard about your business? And what he said is the stuff that all crypto companies kind of think of as boring, like customer acquisition funnels and marketing costs and things like that on the demand side. Like, crypto startups are usually pretty good at go-to-market, like token demand gen, but actual customer demand gen, not so much, unfortunately. So I think that is changing with DePIN in particular, because people do come from a lot of like vertical domain expertise and having built other kinds of businesses before entering crypto. And I think that's actually a strength here. On the demand side, the cool thing with us is that all those games that are already under Beamable, we control the way traffic to various servers happens there. So we can route it to the DePIN network, which means that we can onboard all of this traffic. We'll tell them what we're doing. We're not keeping anything secret, but it's not like we go out and like get a sign off every time, because really all that they care about is, do we fulfill the SLAs?
And are the SLAs being fulfilled by something in existence today?
Yeah. So Beamable is a platform today that runs, and today it's running off centralized capacity because we built it initially around Amazon. So Amazon does work most of the time, and it's worked well for us for 99.9% of the time, and we've fulfilled those SLAs. And Amazon will continue to be providing node capacity in the DePIN as well. The difference there, though, is Amazon's pricing is higher, a lot higher than like a bare metal service provider. But you need a range for a truly liquid model for compute. You need a spectrum of different providers. You need the bare metal service providers that can offer compute affordably, as well as like the hyperscalers are still going to be in there pricing at a higher level because they can sustain the biggest spikes. And sometimes you need spikes in usage when it's necessary to do that. That said, our vision is that as we have more and more and more bare metal service providers, you end up with the equivalent of a virtual hyperscaler by aggregating.
Right. So you've acquired the customers today, maybe you've used Amazon, but you have the contracts with the customers today. And now you're trying to say, okay, can we roll out this kind of decentralized version of AWS, slowly transitioning them to something that is decentralized? That's the playbook.
That's exactly right. And the business model is very different because it's usage based when people come to us. So versus you go to Amazon and pay the I think you said $4,000 or $5,000 a month. Yeah. Which, by the way, like, you can spend so much more than that on AWS.
I know. And it would jump to like 15K because we ran some AI model and didn't pay attention for like a week. So,
and that's also part of like our story to game developers too, which is we bring them so much more capital efficiency. So in the typical setup, first of all, on Beamable, it's free for a certain level of usage that's adequate for developing your game. I don't know of any developers that have gone beyond the free capacity of 500,000 API calls per month that we just give everybody to use. So what that does is you could build a game essentially with zero back-end cost until it actually starts to scale. And the idea is we win together. When your game hits and it has zillions of users, you'll start paying for usage in direct proportion to how it's being used, as opposed to have to be a CapEx IT provisioning expert thinking way out ahead of how to like optimize your cost around dedicated reserved instances and things like that, which just gets complicated. So
and so your existing customers are pretty excited about moving to this kind of new format, or will they even know a change? Like, surely they have to. Do they know kind of that Amazon is maybe under the hood to a certain extent in their SLA, or is it totally abstracted? It's just Beamable network. That's who we deal with. We don't kind of know what's behind the compute, and it doesn't matter if it's AWS or a decentralized network at that point that's behind the compute.
Yeah, I mean, we're fully transparent. Everybody knows what we're doing, so there's no secrets here. It's not like we're stealthily putting them on chain with on-chain compute, and they don't know. Like we're pretty out there with everything that we're doing. Ultimately, game developers are very pragmatic, and they care about things like what's it cost, what's its reliability, and we have to prove that. And I think we'll be under the microscope as we shift more and more traffic over to DeepIn, because they'll want to confirm that availability level and the performance and everything that they're used to is still there. So they'll definitely call us out on it. And believe me, like when you're in live ops for games, we get that 3 a.m. in the middle of the night call like, hey, there's a problem with my game.
Yeah.
And we have to be there to help. So if it doesn't, we're going to be the ones sharing that pain with them and then having to fix the problem, because there would be an economic consequence.
But if you guys are successful at doing this is a huge market opportunity. I mean, these studios are dropping millions of dollars on this infrastructure.
Can we talk about the market opportunity actually for a second? Maybe, John, you probably have the numbers better than us, but just give us an idea of the market, the total addressable market, the TAM here.
So I'll just start with the size of the consumer market. So gaming, video games is about a $200 billion a year market. So that's not the part we sell to, because you have to make a game to do that. But what we see on average in the industry is typical publisher, typical studio of a live game, meaning a live service online game, is spending 20% of their top line out for infrastructure cost. So when you combine that with the fact that roughly 95% of revenues generated in the industry today are live services games, we get to about a $35 billion a year market is infrastructure, compute. And there's lots of data out there, like very easy to public check against like big game publishers. Like Roblox is a good example. Roblox last year spent like $1 billion on infrastructure, just them. And at one point they were spending 40% of their top line. There's a weird reason why that's true in Roblox, which is nobody cares about optimizing their back end on Roblox, because they just throw it out there and whatever happens, happens. But they invested in a lot of optimization. I think they got it down to 27. Don't quote me. I'll have to check the latest quarterly, but I think it was down to 27% of their top line was going out the door for infrastructure costs. So if Roblox, with their legions of software engineers and developers, can't get it a lot lower than that, your indie startup or even big publisher is probably not going to have a lot of success doing that either. And I've seen those costs kill startups. I've also just seen like reliability fail too. Like it doesn't even become a cost issue. Like it just falls over.
I got two questions on this then. Number one, do you see costs going down with all these, NVIDIA blue chip companies building out these data centers? And do you see too much saturation coming to the compute market anytime soon? Obviously, they're doing it for AI mainly, but I don't know, just thoughts there.
Yeah, well, they're doing these big compute centers because AI training has to be done essentially with co-located GPUs, because they need super high bandwidth memory and a bunch of other stuff to actually be able to do training, because decentralized training is at least currently still very, very hard to do. But so yes, that's GPUs. CPU-based compute doesn't really have a use case for that level of concentrated data center build out, and that kind of capacity is not what they're putting into like xAI's Colossus, for example. Like that's just tons and tons of GPUs co-located for training. And once you get outside of the training use case of compute, even GPUs can be highly distributed. So inference works great in a decentralized architecture. In fact, I think it'll be the most economic way to distribute AI inference, because we're all sitting around with like these devices, which are actually great AI inference engines. So why not do it off that? Game servers is almost entirely a CPU bound activity, CPU and storage. So it's another one that really benefits from a lot of distributed compute networks, particularly if you build it around fungible units.
So generally, you're not too worried about saturation coming from these blue chip companies building out these centers.
I mean, the demand for compute is so high right now.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not worried that they're overbuilding. If anything, it's being underbuilt, especially on a global scale. Like right now, if you look at even like those massive GPU centers, those are only being built in the US. It's not being built internationally.
China's trying to build, I think, 60 gigawatts worth of
in aggregate
compute out in Western China. But we'll see.
In aggregate, though, for the most part, like it's lots of data centers combined together. It's not like campus grade data centers like Colossus is, at least not yet, but they could certainly get there. But
the compute that's running games, because on your device, like on your gaming computer, it's obviously a GPU. But what you're saying is these are CPU based.
It is.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I thought it, like, for some reason it's like graphics cards in the cloud. But
no, it's not GPU. So there are GPU use cases in gaming, but it's more around pixel streaming. So like Aether, for example, is a good example of that. And Aether actually is a partner who's very complementary to us. We go to market with them all over the place, because to operate a game in what's called cloud streaming, you need the pixel streaming capability, which basically means you have GPUs in the cloud that are generating the gaming front end and then streaming it to the user in kind of like what we're doing right now. You're using video stream tech to deliver the content to the recipient, but you're generating the frames of the game in the cloud on a GPU. Even if you do that, you still need game servers. You still need things to deal with persistent state, interpret rules, things like that. And that part has the same scaling requirements, whether or not you do cloud-based pixel streaming. So pixel streaming seems like there's quite a few projects going after that at this point, and we feel complementary to all of them.
So maybe we can pivot here, touch on the token a little bit. We didn't get the full team. You have a big company here. Maybe just give us an idea of the scale of the team, because I don't think we touched on that. So real quick.
Yeah, not too big, but big enough for where we are in our development. But we've got 35 people. It's almost all engineers and developers. So that's the company side. What else can I tell you about?
No, that's good. Maybe just your thoughts. Do you plan on keeping it pretty lean? Is that something? Obviously, we see bloat being an issue in these big companies. But is your mindset just keep it lean, move as a unit? I don't know. What's your mantra there as a team?
Yeah, well, I mean, another comparison to the way we're thinking about it is this is an Airbnb like business model for compute. Like, we're not going to own data centers. Mm-hmm. Other people supply the data centers, and then we kind of Airbnb the capacity off of them. So we're not going to bloat by trying to also become a data center company. That would actually just be contrary to the whole idea of building a decentralized compute network. Where we need to emphasize our efforts is on technology. And there's kind of two main sides to that. One is the game developer SDKs, because we always want to be the number one easiest way that a game developer can build any backend. Because the reality is game developer, like we kind of talked about this during the show, but like game developers don't care about blockchain. They don't care about nodes. They don't care about all this stuff that like we're talking about on the show. They actually only care about, am I making a fun game? Hopefully that's their number one aim. Am I making a fun game? And then how do I get that fun game out the door faster and more capital efficiently? So regardless of everything we've just talked about, we can only win if we're the very best way that any game developer can build a backend for their game. And one of the key things we've found to do that is give people an SDK with a very easy workflow, plugs into the tools, the languages, the patterns that they're already familiar with. And that's why the 100-ish games that have already launched on our platform came to us, because we made that piece easy for them. So that's one half. And then the other half is really the protocol itself. And we know that it's important for us not to build all the back-end tech that could ever exist for game developers, because there's just too many things. And that's why, again, we're focusing on a protocol and hosting not only the game server logic that you need, but we think there's a whole market out there, an emergent market of people who build solutions or pieces of backends to games that could be crowdsourced and shared across a community of developers. We don't want to build that. We just want to open it all up through open source and an open network to add your software to the ecosystem. And part of the protocol that we built, the vision of the protocol, because we actually have more work on this marketplace piece, is to be able to have software modules that you supply to the network that can run on the DPIN, and you could apply either a royalty fee or a licensing fee on top of it for games that want to incorporate that into their back end, which, by the way, is a very familiar model to the front end, like people who build in Unity, Unreal, et cetera. Like, they have lots of things that they can access to help accelerate the front end. That has never existed on the back end because it's hard to create a flexible business model that actually allows for payment, because back-end code has to scale up and down. So you add all that complexity of like usage sensitive stuff on the back end. And that's something that we see as also a role for DPIN.
So on the note of DPIN, we see a lot of DPIN tokens launch, and most of them suffer tremendously from inflation. Maybe give me your thoughts on your token, how you kind of are planning to avoid inflation, if it's an inflationary token at all, and some of the use cases and utility here to keep this ship sailing.
Well, the big picture is we want it to be a deflationary token, and we do that by having a model that aligns the underlying business KPIs to the way the protocol works and using. So let me take you through it. So when API calls are delivered through the network, that's a revenue event. Like, API calls are not free. Nodes operate on the network to earn from offering API calls of capacity. So they get paid for that. They can get paid in either Beamable token, which we incentivize by keeping the fee structure super low, or they can pay in stable coins, because we think a lot of game developers, again, they don't want to think of token-based pricing. They want to just go with what they know. If you pay in stable coin, there's a higher fee, 15 to 20% added on top of it. So what that then does is the 15 to 20%, we're earmarking half of that for buybacks to take token back out of circulation. Now, in the early days of this protocol, the percentage and like the impact on that from a float and circulating supply standpoint, it starts small, but as the network gets more and more used and you start to see the API calls go from 10 billion to 100 billion to a trillion, and it's generating revenue, then it starts to become really, really significant. So there is a period of, distributing tokens to people as incentives to stand up nodes and checker nodes and things like that to get the network off the ground. I think we've been mindful of the supply versus the demand piece, and to actually have demand present on the network. But the big picture is really just have a protocol that drives deflation of the token according to actual revenue-based utilization of the network.
Do you guys have a tokenomics sheet out yet that I can look at? I'm on the website here.
Yep, you can go to if you look at the white paper, it's inside the white paper. There's a token section.
Sweet. Oh, okay. And so then to recap that, so you have two payment options. It's either stables or the Beamables token. And then if someone pays in stables, 15 to 20% of that, which is the margin, basically the difference, will go towards buybacks. And then are those tokens burned or kept in treasury? Help me understand that.
So in the early days, we're keeping them in treasury. Ultimately, we would expect to burn them, but as a brand new protocol, I don't actually believe in launching right into burn too aggressively, because the fact is you don't know enough about the total dynamics of the network in those early days. And we could use it for things like incentives to developers to get on the network and things like that would fuel the flywheel a lot more. But yeah, I think that seems to be the most proven model for DPINs that are actually operational over a longer term, like a Helium is, I think, now discovering that when you do the burn model, that it actually is the thing that can drive token value accrual over the long term. Yeah, we're talking about things that are like deep down the roadmap of the life of Beamable as we roll this thing out, but that's where we would expect to be.
Okay, and then one more question too. With the stablecoin payment being 15 to 20% higher, are those prices still competitive with competition?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, because if you look at bare metal service providers, they're typically pricing 50 to 70% less than a hyperscaler anyway, and bandwidth is actually even much less than that, like 90%. So the underlying capex and even sort of the operating fees that bare metal service providers offer to customers is quite a bit lower than hyperscalers. Now, why aren't all people just on bare metal service providers? It's because there's a lot more complexity, right? So you still have to build a lot of things that automate and get people on the network and onboard them and potentially even distribute demand over multiple data centers, which is the whole point of having the protocol here, is automating a lot more of that for everybody.
When you say bare metal service providers, are those just people with data centers that are not AWS?
Yeah. So when you go to AWS, you not only get access to computers, but you get tons of like other software infrastructure and services and things that are all built around
Value-added stuff. Got it.
Yeah, and they're great. They do things, and if you don't mind kind of getting more and more locked in over time, which is what they built their business around, then they work great. But bare metal service providers are basically racks of computers you can rent.
Fair.
And then it's on you. Like whatever you want to do on those computers, you load it up.
Yeah. I see here you have 28% investors. Did you guys do private funding rounds? Like what's kind of the funding backdrop for Beamable, the company?
Yep, we've raised 23 million in venture capital in the company. The last round was led by Bitcraft, which is pretty well known in crypto as well as gaming. All those investors and the core team, which includes me, we're all on the same unlock schedule. So in a year, the first 10% unlocks, and then it's linearly over 24 months after that. So we've got a 3-year hot time horizon to be there, creating a lot of value in the network before we really see anything.
Dom, I don't know if you unmuted there, but yeah.
No, this is all good. I think we have a really comprehensive understanding of what you guys are doing here. Interestingly, staying on the gaming side, we talked so much today about AI and compute for that. So it's interesting that you're not focusing in that direction. I think we understand the token, we understand the team. I'm pretty good on questions. John, I know.
Last thing I would ask is you have Meteora's logo there. Can you just describe the relationship with Meteora and how you're launching? Sorry, Don.
Yeah, you're good.
I mean, high level, we think of ourselves as an internet capital markets product. Like we've talked about gaming and DPIN and servers, but ultimately this is about creating a new capital structure around compute as a resource and making it tradable, aligned to market forces for pricing, all of that stuff that we've kind of touched on. And we've just found a lot of alignment with Meteora in that vision. So we're eager to continue working with them to create the capital structures around that. And we'll have some liquidity on Meteora after we launch the token, as well as other places. And we hope to talk more about some of those other places really soon. Yeah.
Feel free to just drop it all right now. Forget the roadmap, forget the schedule.
I don't think I can without those people saying, okay, we're good to go, but we're very close. Yeah, I think
the rule on MCG is if you start talking about it, you got to finish.
Well, bring me back.
There we go. We can do that. Are you going to be in Abu Dhabi for Met Dhabi?
Of course. Yeah.
You said yeah?
Yes, of course. That's the breakpoint event of the year. So we're going to be there with all our buddies from Solana and Solana Gaming, and
we'll see you.
Mixes and Metaplex and etc.
Yeah. There we go. We're excited.
Yeah, we're also going to be there hosting some stuff. But sorry, I don't think we asked this, but how much are you trying to raise or looking to raise?
2 million in the token sale.
Okay, that's not like crazy or
it's not insane.
It's pretty modest.
What would that put the valuation at? At what valuation?
2 million FTV.
Okay, cool. All right, I think that covers it. John, thanks for coming on. It was great talking to you. Pretty interesting stuff here. So we're gonna have to be tracking your development, and like you said, we'll get you back on when the token's launched and things are, smooth sailing.
And we'll see you in Abu Dhabi.
From your lips to God's ear. Thanks. Yeah, it's going to be an exciting couple of weeks. Thanks for having me on.
Take it easy, John.
All right, take care.